how to address the decades-old issue of only Jehovah's Witnesses will survive Armageddon. I am sure this is a topic that you've covered at least one time if you're a former JW. The typical first response you get from a believing witness is, "That isn't true. God will read people's hearts." This is a topic that can turn into a crazy discussion that brings up many more objections that you'll have to deal with. It can be an enlightening one as well, since it turns out that there generally are two different types of witnesses when dealing with this topic. On the one hand, there are witnesses that just don't know the true doctrine of their religion, while on the other hand, there are witnesses that know it is the doctrine, yet try to skirt around the issue and just never talk about it. And sometimes you have no idea which category your interlocutor falls into until you have this conversation. There are several points that you can use to tackle this. The first thing you could say after them bringing out the God reads hearts response is, "Well, that isn't my understanding from my time when I was a witness. The publications and what was taught from the platform always indicated to me that you had to be a witness in the organization to have any chance at being saved at Armageddon. Can you provide me with anything from the publications that states that?" This will likely catch them off guard, since it means they may have some research ahead of them. And, as you can imagine, this research will be frustrating for them because they will find nothing in print that says anything regarding Jehovah reading people's hearts at Armageddon and that you don't have to be a witness. Now, sure, they may find articles that talk about how God reads people's hearts, but be sure to point out the context of any article they show and find out if it does indeed say that God reads hearts and that you don't have to be a JW to survive. It may deflate or frustrate them a bit as they start figuring out that their belief is actually much more extreme than they once thought. There are some interesting key facts that you can bring out regarding the activities of Jehovah's Witnesses if the teaching truly was God reads hearts. If that doctrine were true, then it makes the preaching work absolutely pointless. God could instantly read everyone's hearts all at once and at the snap of a finger bring about the end. It would put an end to all the suffering in the world and allow his people to worship him fully as he intended. Ask them to explain why there's so much urgency to the preaching work if God's just going to read people's hearts. The real reason they consider the preaching work to be urgent is because it's a warning message. People will be judged not based on their heart condition, but how they respond to the preaching work and how much they support the faithful and discreet slave during the time of the end. It's urgent because it means their life or death depending on those factors. And in the minds of JWs, they are living in the final part of the last days. Now, once you've gotten them to this point, they may start to backtrack a little bit and mention how the preaching work isn't just for the public. They recognize that the preaching work is more for their own faith and keeping themselves busy working for the organization and, Jehovah's service. So even if they aren't successful in their ministry, it's keeping their faith strong. If they try to derail the conversation a bit by bringing this up, don't let them do it. Keep them on track. You can now mention the fact that by delaying Armageddon, God is just increasing the death toll to come. Have them look up the stats for the previous year on how many people were baptized as Jehovah's Witnesses versus how many people were born into the world. As an example, on their 2021 service year report, they show that a little over 171,000 people were baptized. Then when you check out how many people were born that year, you find that that number is probably around 133 million. So 171,000 versus 133 million. That is a lot of people who are essentially going to receive a death sentence for not being born into the right family, in the right country, and at the right time. It is astounding how many hours it takes to just convert one person to the religion. The 2021 report gives the figure at over 8,000 hours per baptism. And those figures include people who were born and raised in the religion and have decided to get baptized. It isn't an actual number of those that they reach in their door-to-door work. You can also factor in the world population growth rate. For recent years, that's varied between probably 0.9 and 1.3%. Now, check out the growth rate for JWs in the 2021 report, which comes to a grand total of 0.7%. And as an interesting side note, they even went to negative 0.6 in the 2020 report. So even though witnesses spend over 1.4 billion hours preaching, their growth rate didn't even keep up with the world population rate. With the amount of time and effort they spend preaching, they should be seeing a rate that is much higher than just the world population growth rate. Seeing the actual numbers may be shocking to a JW since they've likely only heard the positive propaganda pieces on their successes in the preaching work. The preaching work is an utterly massive failure. At some point, you can highlight what the teachings actually are, and to do so, you need them to get them to look up what the publications truly say, and show them directly from jw.org so they can't claim that they're fake or have been doctored. I'd recommend that you go to jwfacts.com for a comprehensive list to choose from. And if you find yourself in this conversation with no preparation, what you can do is look up jwfacts.com on your device, then ask them to go to jw.org on their device and to look up a specific article. Go through at least a few articles so that they get the picture that this wasn't something that was just stated as an isolated teaching. You could point out that these aren't beliefs that are old light and have changed over the years. It is still the current doctrine, and even recently they've commented on it. The next trick in their bag may be, well, you're just reading into something that isn't there. What you can do is ask, so if you were to read these paragraphs to someone at the door with no other knowledge for or against this issue, what would they think these statements mean? When I brought this up to a JW who was trying to challenge me on this, they just went silent. They know exactly what these articles say, as uncomfortable as it may be. At some point, they may try to bring up the frequently asked question article on jw.org regarding salvation. It's entitled, "Do Jehovah's Witnesses feel that they are the only ones who will be saved?" While they think this article deals with the matter at hand, it actually doesn't. This article twists the real question, which is, do Jehovah's Witnesses feel that they are the only ones who will survive Armageddon? They're asking the question that they want to answer and ignoring the one they don't. Point out that the article is only talking about people that get resurrected in the new system, not what happens to people at Armageddon. You could also point out an interesting portion of a video shown during one of the Jade and Nita dramatizations, where Jade has a return visit or a Bible study who is appalled at the idea of God slaughtering billions of people. Take a look.
So God is love, but he's going to kill billions. How's that work?
Well, it'll make sense later. But for now, let's just focus on what I was talking about earlier. What's so nice about this chapter is that it's talking about prayer. Well, it's talking about how Jehovah helps us with prayer. And so it's really lovely because we can pray to someone that's...
Notice that Jade didn't say, "Oh no, our loving God would never do that." Instead, she goes along with it and says, "It'll make sense later." That would have been the perfect opportunity to clear up that matter, and yet this was scripted and filmed to show JWs how to skirt around the problem with that teaching, effectively trying to hide it until someone is so indoctrinated that they no longer have a problem with it. After presenting all of this, they will likely respond with, "Well, that's not what I believe personally." To which I'll give them some credit for showing a stronger moral fiber than the organization they're a part of. But there's still a major problem and issue with this type of thinking. What would happen if you taught this personal view that you have and told people in the ministry or made comments at the meeting that you didn't need to be a witness to be saved, and that all that's required is for God to read your heart and see that you're a good person? Every JW knows that this would never work. If perhaps you get a JW who is willing to, after all of this, finally admit that this is the true teaching, you might get a response like this. Well, it isn't really that surprising because, it's biblical, since God has the right to do anything he wants. He showed us that he was willing to destroy everyone when he did so at the flood of Noah's day. Then they might jump to the analogy of renting your house out to someone and then having to kick them out if they don't take care of the place per the rental agreement. However, That analogy makes no sense and doesn't work because you wouldn't be allowed to murder them for some infraction related to your rental agreement. It falls apart under the least bit of scrutiny, and it's just a go-to example that JWs have been trained to use. If your conversation takes a path anything like what I've mentioned here, be careful not to press too hard, especially if it seems like they're getting a little upset. Be alert to the cues that it's time to back off and perhaps change the conversation to another topic. Ending the conversation can be a bit difficult depending on the type of person you're dealing with. If you want to, you can just gently point out, well, I was just a bit confused by our conversation since you started it by saying that it wasn't the teaching, then you agreed that it was, and then you stated that it's totally okay for God to handle matters that way. Anyway, it doesn't really matter right now. We don't have to discuss that anymore. And then you can find another friendly topic to move to. As usual, this conversation isn't likely to wake them up, but it may shock them to understand one of their actual beliefs. It could be something that makes them think, and perhaps as time goes by, it becomes a conversation that sticks with them that they can't shake off. Hope this helps.